So we turn now to generative linguistics, or modern linguistics, if you like, which emerged in the second half of the 20th century. At the heart of this is the treatment of something called syntax, which we'll have more to say on in just a little bit. Syntax is roughly what you think of as grammar. It's the rules that dictate what orders of words, what sequences of words are admissible and what are not. But before we delve into the details, let's just note that generative linguistics, unlike structural linguistics, became entangled with lots of other fields through the emergence of the computer metaphor and people talking about information all the time. So it got this kind of linguistics becomes part and parcel of what will give rise to cognitive psychology, and it greatly influences philosophy of mind, as we've seen. And you can't overlook the one towering figure when it comes to modern linguistics, and that's Noam Chomsky, seen there at the bottom right. Still around, still in his 90s, still a very, very active person. Has been out to UCD 3 times in recent years, but I suspect he's getting a little old to come back. It was Noam Chomsky, who we encountered before, who wrote a scathing review of Skinner's book on language called Verbal Behavior, in which he pointed out that you couldn't understand language as mere habit because our language use is always creative. Most sentences that are uttered are entirely novel. They're not simply canned responses to familiar situations. With Chomsky comes into being then a form of linguistics which treats of different areas in linguistics. Together they make up generative linguistics. And we're going to have a tour of the different areas of generative linguistics. Those are numbers 2, 3, 4, and 5 on this slide. But we're going to start with 2 areas. We're going to start and finish with areas which are not in generative linguistics. So we're going to have a little tour, starting with pragmatics and then semantics. Pragmatics is not part of generative linguistics. It is concerned with meaning. Semantics is part of generative linguistics, and it's also concerned with meaning. So we'll see how meaning looks outside of generative linguistics and inside of generative linguistics. Syntax and morphology are at the heart of generative linguistics. We'll look at them. And then we'll look at the last 2, phonology and phonetics, both of which are concerned with sound. But phonology is concerned with sound inside generative linguistics, and phonetics is concerned with sound outside generative linguistics. So once more, we've got a matched pair of disciplines, one of which lies inside and one of which lies outside generative linguistics. So let's start with pragmatics, the study of meaning, roughly. Now, it's very difficult to say what we mean, as we know. Whenever we want to say what we mean, we just add more words, right? This caused the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein to give up on the idea that there was ever going to be a firm theory of meaning. And he said, you know, if you want to find out what words mean, don't just ask for more words. Ask what's been done? What's language been used for? What's it achieving? That was his vague idea. Pragmatics asks this kind of question. It asks what's going on when language is being used. So there are words that are spoken, for example, and there are people involved who have certain intentions. They want to get things done. And to understand meaning, we have to understand what people want these words to do. So this is not a very literal approach to meaning. So if someone says, can you pass the salt at the dinner table, and you say yes, and you don't pass the salt, well, that's kind of stupid, isn't it? If someone says, can you pass the salt, they're not asking you really about your abilities. They want you to do something. They want you to pass the salt, obviously. So meaning is not just a matter of interpreting words. We need to understand the context in which those words arise. And when we interact linguistically, we're normally collaborating or cooperating in a particular discourse. This is true even if we're arguing. And one guy who brought a lot of sense to this. There's a guy called Grice who introduced the idea of conversational maxims. Now, a maxim is not a rule. It's like a rule, though, but it's a rule you can break. It's fine to break a maxim. So when we're having an argument, be it a friendly debate or a full-on shouting match, in each case, we will nonetheless exhibit some form of cooperative behaviour which determines who's going to speak, when they're going to speak, how much information they're going to provide, and so on. And Grice tried to organise this by spotting what were the unspoken rule-like things behind conversations. What are these sort of game rules that people having a conversation are playing by, even if they don't know them? And he came up with a big long list, and we'll just mention a few of them here. The maxim of truth says, for example, don't say what you believe to be false. Now, of course you can say what you believe to be false. Hell, you can tell an outright lie. But if we're having a conversation, the default assumption of everyone in the conversation is that people are generally telling the truth. If I have some reason to believe you're not telling the truth, the conversation will change, and change drastically. So when a maxim is flouted or not adhered to, that in itself becomes important and changes the character of a conversation. Likewise, don't say that for which you lack adequate evidence. If you come in and you tell me there's a flood outside, I'm going to assume you've seen something to give that licenses that belief, that you have some information that I don't. And if you start making claims for which you have no evidence, something that also happens, then our conversation is going to be somewhat different. This is how Paul Grice is approaching this topic. The maxims of quantity say, provide the information that's sort of useful at a given point, but don't provide too much information. You're familiar with the problem of too much information. Both of these seem to underlie normal conversational behavior. And of course, you can both withhold information and provide too much information, but as you do so, the person you're talking to will notice that, and they will understand what's going on now differently. Likewise, in a conversation, by default, we're relevant. We make contributions that are relevant, and we try not to be obscure or ambiguous. We try to keep our contributions fairly short and orderly, well organized, and all of those maxims can be broken, but when they are broken, you end up with a different kind of conversation. These all have sort of default values. They're assumptions that people engaging in conversation make. And if you violate them, there's no penalty for that, but it changes the nature of the conversation. So that's the way pragmatics approaches meaning. It's something that's inextricably bound to context. It's inextricably bound to the actual situation in which the words are used. It's not about an abstract notion of a word. It's about the word that Paul said at the dinner table at 5 p.m. on Friday. It's not very abstract. Now we're going to look at meaning as it appears in generative linguistics. And this is completely abstract. This is the domain known as semantics. Semantics also claims to study meaning, but it's meaning in an abstract sense in which we consider words independently of any context in which they're uttered, independently of who is saying them and why and where and when. You might think that to ignore all that will leave very little, but abstraction is a powerful tool, and we can spot, for example, that there are patterns we can observe among sentences that have to do with meaning, independently of where they're uttered. So a sentence like, all Dubliners are not dumb, bears a principled relationship to a sentence like, not all Dubliners are dumb. And we could construct very many sentences that have similar relations of meaning. What's the difference between these two? Well, if I claim all Dubliners are not dumb, you can disprove that claim by bringing me a dumb Dubliner. Might happen. If, on the other hand, I claimed not all Dubliners are dumb, that claim is not invalidated if you bring me a dumb Dubliner, only if you demonstrate that every single Dubliner is dumb. That's semantics at the sentence level, but we can do this at the word level. We can Sometimes we might choose to use the word student, and sometimes we might choose to use the word pupil. And we can say, hang on, there's kind of a similarity in meaning behind these. They mean almost the same thing. Sometimes they might mean the same thing, and sometimes they don't. Now, in primary school, I'm going to refer to the kids as pupils. In university, I'm going to refer to you as students. In secondary school, sometimes we use the word pupil, sometimes we use the word student, and there's a bit of overlap. So you can see that these meanings are related. They're not exactly the same thing, but they're not unrelated. So semantics studies these kinds of relationships, which are meaning independent of the context in which the words are used. And typically, in the domain of semantics, the tools of formal logic are used. Indeed, sentences like all Dubliners are not dumb, when contrasted with not all Dubliners are dumb, we discussed their relationship using logical tools. How would you disprove this? If we restrict our attention just to the semantics of individual words, there's lots of kind of relationships we can see. Just like student and pupil overlap there. Sometimes we'll find words that seem to have the same meaning. This is relatively rare in a strict sense. In a loose sense, that's probably very common. But it's relatively rare to find two words which can be completely interchanged, where it doesn't matter which word you use. I think maybe sofa and couch would be a good example here of synonyms. That is, anywhere you say the words couch, you could have said the word sofa and vice versa. But maybe there are exceptions to that. So pure synonyms are probably rare, but approximate synonymy, as with student and pupil, is very common. But if words can have the same meaning, some pairs of words can have opposite meanings. Not every word has an opposite. Up has an opposite in down. In has an opposite in out. Orange doesn't have an opposite. Not every word has an opposite. There's no opposite to horse. But if two words have this relationship, they are antonyms. Some words have several different meanings, and those meanings can either be related because they stem from a common source idea, that's polysemy, or they can be unrelated, in which case the appearance of being the same word is a bit misleading because they got here differently. For example, the word chip can be used to describe potato crisps, well, or stuff you get in a chipper, even more likely in Ireland. It can also be used to describe something that you knock off a block of wood while you're chopping wood, or the chip inside a computer, a silicone chip inside a computer. That might seem very far from the humble potato, but the core idea of a thin slice of something taken off a larger block underlies all of these, and that's why they're all chips. So that's polysemy. We can use the word bank to describe the place that keeps your money, or we can use it to describe the side of a river. And they look like the same word, but they're not. They don't have a common origin in the same way that the different uses of chip do. So polysemy and homonymy identify different relationships between the multiple meanings of a given word form. Some words pick out categories at different levels of abstraction. So, for example, I could say shape. We know what a shape is. There are lots of different kinds of shape. And a polygon is a particular kind of shape. It's a shape that has a number of even sides, of equal sides. And furthermore, we could pick out a triangle and say that's a particular kind of polygon. That's a polygon with 3 sides. So a polygon is a hyponym of shape, and a triangle is a hyponym of polygon. Hypo means below. And you could play the same game using hypernyms. You could say that polygon is a hypernym of triangle, and so on. I won't bore you with this. You can see the way meaning has been treated here is completely different from what we saw in pragmatics. In pragmatics, meaning was absolutely tied to the context in which words were used and the intentions and goals of those people who were using the words. Whereas generative linguistics performs this act of abstraction and considers things independently of any context of use. In the next video, we're going to dive deeper into generative linguistics, looking at the abstract properties of syntax and morphology.